All right, we're diving into a really fascinating legal puzzle today. We've got a sitting head of state, Nicolás Maduro of Venezuela, who's been charged with some serious crimes. But here's the twist. It's not by some international tribunal, but by the United States itself. And that, right there, raises a huge question. I mean, think about it. How can one country just charge another country's president with a crime? In its own courts? It feels like it should be impossible, right? Like it totally defies the whole idea of international law. Well, to really get our heads around this, we've got to break it down, piece by piece. Okay, so here's our roadmap for this explainer. First, we'll get into the specific charges against Maduro. Then we're going to put his case side by side with other world leaders you've probably heard about. That's going to lead us straight into the two very different kinds of justice at play here. And finally, we'll get to the heart of it, this idea of presidential immunity. And this is the interesting part, why it might not be the get-out-of-jail-free card you'd think it is. All right, Section 1. Let's start with the absolute basics. Who exactly is being charged, and what for? Okay, now this is the detail that makes this whole thing so unique. We're not talking about war crimes in an international court, like The Hague. Nope. This is a U.S. federal court in New York using U.S. law. The charges, drug trafficking and narco-terrorism. And narco-terrorism is pretty much what it sounds like. The accusation is that he's using drug money to fund terrorism. So what the U.S. is doing here is basically treating him like any other person they think broke their laws. Now, you've probably heard about other world leaders facing legal issues, and honestly, it can all start to sound the same. It gets confusing. So let's take a second to really clarify how Maduro's situation is totally different from some of these other big cases in the news. So just to recap on Maduro, his case is a U.S. domestic criminal charge. Simple as that. It's one country's legal system pointing the finger directly at him. Now, compare that with Vladimir Putin. His situation, totally different. He's facing an arrest warrant from the International Criminal Court, the ICC, for alleged war crimes. See, this isn't a U.S. court. It's a global one, set up by a big international treaty. And it's a similar story for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. The ICC prosecutor is seeking arrest warrants for him too, also for alleged war crimes. So legally speaking, this puts him in the same boat as Putin. He's under the eye of an international body, not just one country's court. Okay, and then we've got Bashar al-Assad from Syria. His situation is different yet again. He's not being targeted by the U.S. or the ICC. Instead, you have individual countries like France going after him using this principle called universal jurisdiction. It's a really interesting idea. It basically says that some crimes are just so awful, think war crimes, that any country on earth has the right to prosecute them, no matter where they happen. So this table really just lays it all out so clearly. Just look at that legal basis column. For Maduro, it says U.S. domestic law. For everyone else, it's international treaty or universal jurisdiction. That right there, that is the fundamental difference we absolutely have to understand. And that brings us right to the main lesson here, the huge difference between the kind of court going after Maduro and the ones dealing with leaders like Putin and Netanyahu. It all comes down to one thing. Where does the court get its power? A U.S. federal court? It gets its authority from U.S. law. That's it, full stop. The ICC, on the other hand, gets its power from that international treaty we mentioned, the Rome Statute. And because their power comes from different places, they play by totally different rule books, especially when you start talking about immunity. And here it is, the Rome Statute. You can think of this as the Constitution or the rule book for the ICC. And it says black and white that being a president or a prime minister is not a defense against charges like war crimes. But, and this is a really big but, the U.S. never signed on to this treaty. Neither did Russia, for that matter. And that's exactly why this rulebook doesn't apply to Maduro's case in a New York court. Okay, so if the ICC's rulebook is out, what rules do apply? Well, that leads us straight to what should be Maduro's single best defense, this old, powerful idea of head of state immunity. Yeah, so there's this thing called customary international law. It's basically the set of unwritten rules that countries have agreed to follow for centuries, just out of tradition. And one of the biggest rules is you don't prosecute another country's leader. The thinking is that all nations are sovereign and equal, so you can't just drag their president into your courtroom. I mean, it's a cornerstone of how diplomacy works. So you can bet that if Maduro ever actually ended up in a U.S. court, his lawyers would be hammering this point home. They'd argued, look, he's a sitting head of state, he has immunity under international law, the U.S. violated Venezuela's sovereignty and broke the rules by even filing these charges. And you know what? It's a really strong traditional argument. But, and there's always a but, isn't there? That powerful shield of immunity, it's got some pretty big cracks in it. So let's look at exactly why that defense, as good as it sounds on paper, would probably fall apart inside a U.S. courtroom. And here are the 4 big reasons why. First, and this is the absolute knockout punch, the U.S. government doesn't officially recognize Maduro as the legitimate president of Venezuela. And in the U.S., the courts almost always follow the lead of the government on who they recognize. So no recognition, no immunity. Simple as that. Second, prosecutors would argue that drug trafficking isn't exactly an official act of a president, right? It's just a crime. And finally, at the end of the day, U.S. courts care about U.S. law. What some international court said once upon a time isn't going to stop them. Okay, so after all that, what does it all add up to? Let's zoom out for a second and think about the big picture here and what this all really means. Well, when you lay it all out like this, the bottom line becomes pretty clear. Inside a U.S. courtroom, all those classic defenses from international law, they're just not going to hold much water. His claim to absolute immunity as a head of state has a low chance of success because, again, the U.S. doesn't recognize him. And arguing about sovereignty, that's probably not going to be enough to stop the trial. And you know, this case is about so much more than just Nicolás Maduro. It really shines a spotlight on this massive tension in how the world works. On one side, you have the right of a nation, like the United States, to enforce its own laws. On the other side, you have this ancient principle that says sovereign countries and their leaders get a pass. It's a fundamental clash. And that leaves us with this huge unanswered question. The case against Maduro forces us to confront it head on. In the world we live in today, where does one nation's law end and the global legal order begin? There really is no easy answer to that.